The wind howled like a beast unleashed, cutting through the night as the snow piled higher with each passing hour. In the heart of the Rockies, one man's ingenuity would stand between him and certain death. But what made his cabin different would reveal a truth no one could have foreseen. A man's will to survive could outsmart the fiercest storm. Before we dive into this story, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from. And if tales like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will uncover the most incredible survival story you've ever heard. The year was 1862, and the Rockies were unforgiving as ever. Blizzards weren't unusual, but the one that came in late November was a monster. It swept down from the north with no warning, turning day into night, leaving even the most seasoned mountain men caught off guard. Among them was Ethan McAllister, a trapper who had weathered storms before, but nothing like this. Ethan had built his cabin with the winter in mind, choosing a spot that was sheltered, hidden from the winds, and raised above the snowline. But even the sturdiest structures had limits when faced with the brutal force of nature. His cabin, a small, humble abode made of logs and moss, seemed to shrink under the weight of the snow. The roof groaned under the pressure, and the wind howled like a relentless beast outside. Inside, Ethan paced, checking every corner, every joint of the cabin's structure. He'd learned long ago that survival in the wilderness wasn't just about furs or hunting. It was about the land itself, understanding its rhythms and, most importantly, the weather. The storm had been coming for days. The sky had been darkening, and the winds were shifting, signaling the change. But no one expected this. As the storm intensified, Ethan knew that he couldn't afford to sit and wait. The last thing he needed was for the roof to cave in or for the snow to pack so tightly around the cabin that it could collapse under the weight. He'd already seen it happen to other cabins in the area, those that were hastily constructed without thought for the unrelenting forces of nature. With a grim look on his face, Ethan donned his fur-lined coat, laced his boots, and grabbed his axe. He needed to reinforce his cabin, and he needed to do it quickly. Outside, the snow was already waist-high, and the wind carried stinging ice that cut through his thick fur coat. He began to work on the roof, cutting away the snow that had accumulated in the rafters. But it wasn't just the roof he had to worry about. He could hear the crackling of trees breaking in the distance, the sound of nature being torn apart. Ethan knew that he didn't have much time. The storm raged through the night, showing no mercy. Inside his cabin, Ethan worked feverishly, hauling snow from the roof and using the remaining daylight to gather firewood. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the storm was no ordinary winter squall. It was a force of nature unlike anything he'd ever experienced. By the time evening fell, the snow had accumulated so thickly around his cabin that it seemed as though the entire mountain range was being buried alive. But Ethan wasn't one to panic. His instincts had kept him alive for years in the harshest conditions, and he was determined to outlast this storm. As the temperature dropped, Ethan threw another log on the fire. The warmth inside was a small comfort, but it wouldn't last forever. He knew that once the storm passed, the snow would freeze solid, creating a barrier around his cabin, and that could trap him inside. Ethan's mind raced. What could he do to ensure that he didn't become one of the men who'd been buried alive by a storm? His thoughts turned to the roof. The structure of the cabin was solid, but he couldn't trust that it would hold. The weight of the snow could collapse it if he wasn't careful. With determination in his eyes, he grabbed his tools and headed outside once more. The wind was a howling beast, battering his face as he moved. It took all his strength to push against it, his body aching from exhaustion. The snow was deep now, and the wind made it almost impossible to see. But Ethan's focus never wavered. He needed to reinforce the cabin's walls, and he needed to do it now. With a series of quick, decisive moves, he began to hammer wooden planks into the side of the cabin, creating a barrier that would hold against the weight of the snow. The work was grueling, and his hands bled from the cold, but he didn't stop. He had no choice but to keep going, knowing that if he gave up now, he'd be lost. Finally, after hours of back-breaking work, the storm began to ease. The wind slowed, and the snow fell in gentle sheets. Ethan stood at the edge of his cabin, looking out over the frozen landscape. The worst was over, but it wasn't the storm that had tested him, it was his will to survive. And he knew that no matter what came next, he had the strength to face it. When Ethan awoke, the world was still. The roaring storm that had engulfed the Rockies for the past day had finally died down, leaving only an eerie silence behind. The cabin, which had felt like a fortress the night before, was now buried under a heavy blanket of snow. The light of morning barely pierced the thick layer of clouds overhead, but enough filtered in to show the depth of the snowdrifts around his home. Ethan rose from his makeshift bed, the fire long extinguished, and stretched stiffly. His body ached from the hours of hard labor, but there was little time to rest. Survival in the mountains didn't allow for luxury. The first thing he noticed was the low crackling sound of snow shifting. The weight of it pressing down on his roof would make it vulnerable again if he didn't act fast. With a grunt, he donned his coat once more, pulled his hat low over his brow, and stepped out into the cold. The air was crisp and bitter, and the silence seemed almost unnatural. The sound of his boots crunching through the snow was the only noise he could hear. As he surveyed the landscape, the aftermath of the storm was visible in every direction. Trees bent under the weight of the snow, some snapped entirely, while others were half buried in the drifts. The cabin itself looked smaller now, the doorway nearly covered by snow, and the roof sagging with the load. It was a testament to the storm's ferocity, but it wasn't the time for sentiment. Ethan needed to clear the roof before the melting snow froze and added even more weight. He moved quickly, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, the cold biting at his skin. The snow was packed tightly around the cabin, a solid mass that seemed immovable. As Ethan worked, he couldn't help but think of the others who had been caught in the storm, men who hadn't been as prepared, men whose cabins had already been crushed by the sheer force of nature. His hands were raw as he cleared the snow from the roof, but it wasn't just the snow that concerned him. The real danger came from the possibility of flooding. With so much snow now in the mountains, a rapid thaw could turn the snowdrifts into fast-moving streams, threatening to wash everything away. He paused, looking out at the valley below. He'd survived the storm, but the real test was yet to come. The weather might have passed, but the consequences of this blizzard would ripple through the mountains for weeks. Every day from now on would be a battle not just to survive, but to outsmart the wilderness itself. The days following the blizzard were a blur of work and worry. Ethan worked tirelessly to reinforce his cabin, carving out drainage ditches around its foundation to prevent any potential flooding. Every task he undertook was done with the precision of someone who had learned the hard way that neglect in the mountains could be fatal. As he moved around the cabin, inspecting the damage caused by the snow, his mind was consumed by one thought: the avalanche. While avalanches were not a common threat in the area, the sheer volume of snow that had fallen in such a short period made it a real possibility. Ethan had heard the rumble in the distance during the height of the storm, the sound of snow sliding down the mountainside, gathering speed and power. He knew that if the snow didn't settle properly, or if the weather turned warm too quickly, the avalanche could come barreling down at any moment. It was a real danger. And Ethan knew he couldn't wait for the avalanche to find him. He had to act, and act quickly. With the sun barely rising above the tree line, he packed his tools and set off toward the ridge overlooking the valley. His breath plumed in the air as he moved through the snow, a deep sense of urgency driving him forward. The snow was thick but manageable as he climbed higher. The deeper he went into the mountains, the more pronounced the damage of the storm became. Trees were uprooted, the earth beneath them exposed to the elements. Snow had piled up in thick layers, and Ethan's mind raced through possible scenarios. A flash of heat, the thaw, could bring disaster in an instant. When he finally reached the ridge, the view that greeted him was sobering. The valley below was littered with boulders and jagged debris that had been displaced by the shifting snow. There was no sign of immediate danger, but the sight of the ravaged landscape reminded him how fragile their lives were in this unforgiving wilderness. Ethan spent the next several hours carefully assessing the landscape, noting weak points where snow might collect or where the mountain might crack under the pressure. He carved several small channels into the snow, diverting potential meltwater from key areas that could lead to catastrophic flooding or, worse, an avalanche. It wasn't a foolproof plan, but it was all he could do. With each action, he felt a small sense of control, a fleeting moment where he could impose his will on nature, even if only for a brief time. The battle for survival was far from over, but Ethan knew that as long as he kept thinking ahead, he would be ready for whatever came next. As he made his way back to his cabin, the feeling of isolation began to creep in. The mountains were quiet, the valley still, and Ethan was left alone with his thoughts. He had no way of knowing what the next few days would bring, but he could only hope that his preparations would be enough to see him through. The storm was gone, but the danger wasn't over. Ethan woke before dawn. The fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers, casting a faint, flickering light across the room. The night had been quiet, the storm's wrath now a memory, but a lingering unease filled his chest. The mountains were never truly silent, and Ethan had learned long ago that every shift in the air, every change in the weather, held meaning. Today, he knew, would not be like the others. The stillness outside felt heavy, charged with something he couldn't quite name. He stood, stretching stiffly from a night of restless sleep, his joints aching as if the mountain itself had worked its way into his bones. There was little time to waste. The morning light was beginning to filter through the small window, casting long shadows across the room. Ethan had little patience for idle moments. Outside, the snow had begun to compact under the weight of the storm's aftermath, and his cabin, while still standing strong, had not yet been fully freed from the depths of snow. Before he even made his way to the door, a sound caught his attention, a deep, distant rumble. It was unmistakable. He had heard it before in the wilderness, the foreboding sign of an avalanche in the distance. Ethan's pulse quickened. The avalanche had been his worst fear since the storm had passed, and now the mountains themselves were speaking, their deep groans signaling an ominous shift in the landscape. He moved quickly, his heart pounding as he opened the door. The cold air hit him like a sharp slap, but the snow had already settled, leaving a stark white blanket stretching out in every direction. The sound continued, rolling down the mountainside like a great tidal wave. The earth beneath his feet trembled slightly, as if the land itself were holding its breath. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, a plume of snow erupted into the sky. Ethan's mind raced. The avalanche was coming, and he had little time. His cabin was not on the direct path of the flow, but the shifting snow could create dangerous debris that could tear through the valley and reach his shelter. The next several hours would determine whether he would survive it or be buried under tons of snow and rock. He grabbed his pack, hastily slinging it over his shoulder. There was no time to waste. He had to get to higher ground, beyond the reach of the snow's deadly force. With a quick glance back at the cabin, he set off, making his way toward a ridge where he could observe the avalanche's progress. He couldn't afford to stand still and hope for safety. The avalanche's power was unpredictable, and he would have to stay ahead of it if he had any chance of survival. The wind had picked up again by the time Ethan reached the ridge, and he could feel the temperature dropping as the storm's remnants swirled around him. His breath came in sharp bursts as he climbed, each step a challenge against the harsh conditions and the weight of the gear he carried. The thought of the avalanche gnawed at him. He had seen how fast the snow moved, how quickly it could overwhelm an entire valley, leaving nothing but a frozen wasteland in its wake. As he reached the top of the ridge, the full scope of the avalanche was visible. It had already begun its descent, a massive wall of snow cascading down the mountainside, eating up everything in its path. The earth groaned and rumbled beneath him, the tremors reverberating through his boots. Ethan's eyes narrowed, scanning the valley below, his mind working in overdrive to assess the situation. The avalanche wasn't the only threat. The snow that had fallen during the storm was still unstable in many places, and the mountain terrain had shifted. Trees had fallen, and rocks had loosened, creating treacherous conditions. Ethan knew he couldn't just wait out the storm. He had to keep moving, to stay ahead of the avalanche's path. But as he looked around, he saw something that sent a shiver down his spine, a small group of men, their figures barely visible through the haze of snow. They were trapped. Ethan's heart dropped as he realized they were heading directly into the path of the avalanche. Without hesitation, Ethan set off toward them, yelling over the roar of the wind. He waved his arms, trying to catch their attention, but the men seemed oblivious to the danger. They were too far ahead, too lost in their own tasks to see the destruction closing in on them. Ethan pushed forward, moving faster than he ever had before, every muscle in his body burning with the effort. The avalanche was still a ways off, but time was running out. He had to reach the men before they were swallowed by the snow. His every step was a gamble. the ground beneath him unstable and unpredictable. But he couldn't afford to stop. The wind howled in his face, the snow biting at his skin, but Ethan didn't slow down. His only focus was the men ahead of him and the mountain's relentless power bearing down on them all. Ethan's pulse raced as he fought through the snowdrifts, every step a battle against the biting cold and the relentless winds. The avalanche was coming down faster than he'd anticipated, its roar filling the air, deafening in its intensity. His breath came in ragged gasps, freezing on his face in clouds of steam that barely had time to dissipate before the cold swallowed them again. He could barely see the group of men ahead of him, their forms swaying in the thick, swirling snow, but he knew they had no idea what was coming for them. With every instinct screaming for him to hurry, Ethan pushed forward, his feet slipping on the uneven ground, his legs aching from the strain of running uphill in knee-deep snow. He cursed under his breath, knowing time was slipping through his fingers. The mountain had already begun its deadly descent, and the men were in its path. If he didn't reach them in time, there would be nothing left but the memory of their frozen bodies, buried under the weight of snow. As he drew closer, Ethan shouted again, his voice muffled by the howl of the wind. "Get out of there! Move! Now!" His throat burned from the cold, but the men still didn't seem to hear him. They were too focused on their task. What it was, Ethan couldn't tell, but he knew they couldn't waste a single second more. The avalanche loomed closer, its edge a sheer wall of white, crashing down the mountainside with the fury of 1,000 storms. The air felt thick with pressure, as if the very earth beneath them was about to split apart. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he looked back. The ridge was already starting to fill with snow, and it wasn't long before the valley would be completely covered. He called again, this time louder, as loud as his voice would carry against the tempest. One of the men finally turned, his eyes wide in confusion as he scanned the ridge. His expression shifted from one of uncertainty to sheer panic as he realized what was coming. "Run!" Ethan shouted, pointing toward the higher ground, but the man was already stumbling backward, disoriented by the storm. He didn't see the other men, still absorbed in their work, unaware of the looming catastrophe. Ethan pushed himself harder, his legs burning with effort as he reached the group. He grabbed the first man he could find and pulled him away, shoving him toward the ridge. The snow was already starting to come down in sheets, the ground vibrating beneath their feet. Ethan had no time to explain, no time to tell them to run in the direction of safety. He just pushed, shouted, and pulled, desperate to get them out of harm's way. There was no time for hesitation. The avalanche was closing in, and with each passing second, they were closer to being buried alive. The first man, still stunned, stumbled forward, but the others were slower, confused by the sudden shift in urgency. "Get moving!" Ethan shouted, now using his hands to shove them along the slope. The men's legs moved sluggishly through the snow, as if their bodies had turned to stone, frozen by the overwhelming fear. But there was no room for fear now, just survival. In that moment, the earth seemed to give way beneath them. The ground trembled, the snow began to shift, and then it was as though the mountain itself cracked open. The avalanche was upon them. Ethan didn't look back. He grabbed the last man by the arm and pulled him toward the ridge, climbing, scrambling, dragging him along the rocky path that would take them higher, out of the path of the massive snowstorm descending on the valley. The roar of the avalanche drowned out everything else, the sheer force of it like a tidal wave coming to claim them all. The ground beneath them buckled as the avalanche hit the valley, sending a terrifying cloud of snow and debris surging upward. Ethan pushed forward, his feet slipping and his breath freezing in his chest. The roar of the avalanche was deafening now, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. They reached the ridge just as the avalanche reached its peak. Ethan didn't dare stop, pushing onward until finally they were safely out of its reach. He collapsed onto the rocky ground, gasping for air, his body shaking with exhaustion and the intense cold. The snowstorm's fury had subsided, but the damage it had caused would be felt for days to come. Ethan's heart still pounded in his chest as he looked back toward the valley. The avalanche had come down with a force he hadn't imagined, swallowing everything in its path. Where once there had been trees, rocks, and cabins, there was now nothing but a vast, snow-covered wasteland. The men who had been trapped with him had managed to find their footing, but the shock was evident in their eyes. They had been saved, but at what cost? Ethan knew that the snow would continue to wreak havoc on the land, and any semblance of normalcy they had once known was now gone. One of the men, the one Ethan had grabbed first, looked up at him with gratitude, his eyes wide but filled with disbelief. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with the shock of what had just happened. Ethan nodded, but his mind was already racing with the implications of the avalanche. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need to get to higher ground and wait for the snow to settle. The danger isn't over." The men nodded, but their steps were slow, almost mechanical, as they began moving further up the mountain, away from the destruction they had narrowly escaped. The landscape had changed, transformed into something unrecognizable. Where once there had been a life they could return to, now there was only destruction and the constant threat of more avalanches. Ethan looked around, his eyes scanning the wreckage, but there was nothing he could do. The mountain had already claimed its toll, and there was no going back. For the next few days, the group remained on the ridge, watching the snow settle and the mountains gradually return to their precarious calm. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. The snow was still unstable, and the mountain had been irreversibly changed. As he sat by the fire, watching the others struggle to come to terms with what had happened, Ethan knew one thing for certain: the wilderness had no mercy. It had taken everything from them, and it was a reminder that, no matter how hard one fought, nature was always the ultimate force. And in this battle for survival, only the strong and the resourceful would survive. The days following the avalanche were a blur. The storm had moved on, but its destruction lingered in the valley, leaving behind a stark, raw landscape. The avalanche had taken much trees, cabins, and in some cases, men. The mountain had made its point, and Ethan knew that no matter how much they tried to rebuild, the wilderness always had the upper hand. The group of men he had saved had managed to find shelter, but they were shaken, disoriented. Some were barely holding onto their composure, others unsure of what to do next. But Ethan was different. He had seen the way the mountains could kill, how nature's brutality wasn't just a possibility, it was a reality, one that they would have to accept. There was no luxury of mourning or waiting for help. They had to adapt. Ethan found himself becoming the leader they needed, though he never sought it. He knew the land, he knew the risks, and he knew how to survive. And now, more than ever, survival depended on every last ounce of strength they had left. The first task was simple: rebuild. Ethan had already assessed the remains of the cabins, knowing that they were a lost cause. The snow had buried them deep, and the structural integrity had been destroyed by the weight and force of the avalanche. The men would have to make new shelter temporary at first, but strong enough to withstand whatever came next. For the next several days, Ethan led them in small, methodical efforts. They worked together to gather what materials they could find: fallen trees, broken logs, whatever remained. But Ethan was careful, measuring each piece and ensuring it would be strong enough to endure another storm. They cut and stacked, built walls and roofs, piecing together what little the wilderness had left behind. The effort was grueling, and spirits were low, but there was no time for despair. Survival didn't wait for anyone. Ethan's experience guided them. He knew how to create structures that could resist the force of the elements, how to secure them with the materials at hand. His hands bled from the constant work, his back ached, but he continued without complaint. He had seen men break under less pressure, but for him, there was no alternative. He didn't have the luxury of giving up. As the days stretched on, they built a small, sturdy shelter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to offer them some semblance of safety. They would take turns keeping watch, making sure that the avalanche didn't trigger another cascade of snow and that they would not be trapped again. But even as they found temporary relief, Ethan's mind never ceased to race. The mountain had already claimed so much, and he knew that no matter how much they rebuilt, the wilderness was always a step ahead. When the shelter was finally finished, Ethan gathered the men around the fire. They were exhausted, worn, but alive. He had done what few others could. He had kept them safe, but he wasn't sure how long that would last. The mountain was a constant threat, one that didn't offer second chances. "We made it through this storm," Ethan said, his voice calm but steady. "But there will be more. The land doesn't stop, and we can't stop either. We'll rebuild, and we'll survive, but we have to stay sharp. This land is merciless, and if we don't respect that, it will take us next." The men nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. They had seen what the wilderness could do. Ethan had shown them how to survive it. But survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about never letting the land swallow you whole. Weeks passed, and while the landscape outside remained a haunting reminder of the storm's wrath, Ethan and the men had settled into a new rhythm. Their makeshift shelter had been fortified. The snow had begun to melt in some areas, and the looming threat of another avalanche had lessened at least for the moment. But the mountain was always changing, always shifting. The wilderness, for all its beauty, was a place of danger and uncertainty, and Ethan knew they could never truly let their guard down. The men had begun to accept their new reality, finding solace in the small victories, catching game, gathering wood, keeping the fire burning through the nights. They were no longer the same men who had arrived at this place, expecting the wild to be an untamed adventure. Now, they were a group bound by necessity, hardened by the storm, and united by survival. But Ethan was different. He had always known that the land would push back, that it would test them in ways they couldn't anticipate. And now, after everything they had been through, he knew there was only one true path forward, one that required more than just survival. It required understanding, adapting, and ultimately, respect for the land. As he sat alone by the fire one evening, the mountains looming in the distance, Ethan reflected on what had transpired. The avalanche had been a reminder of the power of nature, a brutal teaching. But in its aftermath, he had learned something deeper, that survival wasn't just about fighting the wilderness, it was about becoming a part of it. The wilderness had shaped him in ways he could not describe, turning him into someone who no longer just endured the mountains but understood them. The rugged beauty of the land, its unforgiving nature, had become a part of him, and in turn, he had passed that understanding on to the men around him. They had survived not because they were strong or lucky, but because they had learned to work with the land, to adapt to its whims, and to respect its power. Ethan stood up and walked to the edge of the camp. The night was still, and the stars above the Rockies shimmered like distant fires. He knew that they would never be truly safe. The mountains would always test them, always threaten to take them back. But he also knew that as long as they remained vigilant, as long as they kept pushing forward, they would endure. The men who had survived the storm were no longer just survivors. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the idea that even in the face of the harshest elements, life could continue. Ethan had shown them that it wasn't the mountains that decided who lived and who died, it was the will to adapt, to learn, and to rise above. In the end, the legacy of the mountain wasn't one of destruction, but of survival. And it was a legacy that would live on in every trapper, every settler, every soul who ventured into the wilderness and found the strength to face its challenges head-on. For Ethan, that was enough. It was a legacy built on more than just living, it was built on understanding the land, mastering it, and becoming one with it. The mountains had taken much, but they had given him a truth that would last far beyond his time.